Here you have some of these writings that are just so phenomenal.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Oh, thank you so much. If you contacted me and tell him I said hi. Thank you. Thank you for that. All right, ladies and gentlemen, time to circle the wagons. Time to begin, maybe a minute or two past, actually. Sorry about that. Time to begin our lecture on Austrian capital theory. I want to offer a certain disclaimer before we begin. My main general policy is no economics before 10 o'clock. And so I'm going the extra mile for the Mises Institute. That's how important the Mises Institute is for Western civilization. So we're going to do our best. One of the things I was not able to get to yesterday when I talked about the division of labor is that the division of labor itself is praxeologically linked with the capital structure. And so when we talk about the capital structure is like the other side of the division of labor coin. That we would not be able to have an extensive division of labor without an extensive capital structure. And the extensive capital structure is made possible by an extensive division of labor. So they go hand in hand. So it is appropriate that this lecture is following up to a certain extent on what I said before. Now, the Austrian capital theory is rooted in the work of Karl Menger and his exposition of the interrelationships of economic goods that Dr. Salerno discussed yesterday morning, where he lays out the distinction between consumer goods, or goods of the lowest order, as Menger would call it, and higher order goods, or producer goods. Consumer goods are those goods that are directly serviceable, that you can consume directly. You don't need to do anything. If you have a bottle of water and you drink it, you don't have to add anything to the water. You don't have to add water to get water. You just drink it, and that's a consumer good. A producer good, of course, is a good that it provides a service. It's helpful, but it doesn't provide direct satisfaction, direct utility, if you will. But it's used to produce something that will give you direct utility. And there are, in general, three large categories of producer goods. There are land and labor, we call the original factors. They are independently productive. Again, we don't have to do anything to manufacture labor. If we're here, we can use our labor. On the other hand, capital goods is another higher order good, and by definition, a capital good is a produced means of production. So a capital good is not independently productive. It has to be produced first, and then can be used in production. If a carpenter wants to use a hammer, hammers don't literally grow on trees. They don't just sort of lay around, dropped by the hammer fairy or whatever overnight, and you just grab it. You have to make the hammer first. It has to be produced, and then you can use the hammer. Now, each consumer good is made possible by its structure of production. And to make a consumer's good, the producer must obtain services of the higher order goods. The services of the necessary land, the necessary labor, and the necessary particular capital goods. And so let's go through an example. I think what a better way to illustrate this principle by considering what it takes to produce one of the pinnacles of Western civilization, which would be the flourless chocolate cake. It's perhaps, I consider it the greatest dessert in the history of Western civilization, which means the greatest dessert in the world. And it's so good. If you haven't ever had one, you have to have one. You put it on your bucket list. It's not something that you taste. It's something you experience. Now, I'm not kidding. I'm prone to hyperbole, but I'm not being hyperbolic at this point. But ask yourself, okay, what does it take to produce something of this magnitude, right? Which, on the other hand, is only one little consumer good. Well, it takes land, of course, and labor. So you have this German pastry chef standing in a German kitchen. It takes a bowl and a spatula. It takes a pound of semi-sweet chocolate, a half a pound of butter, and 8 eggs. I told you it was good. I'm not making it up, right? You need a mixer. A KitchenAid stand-up mixer is probably the best. Spring-form pan. You need a conventional oven, and you also need a microwave oven that I don't have here. Electricity would be good, or some type of power. But anyway, you need these high-order goods that are used to make this flourless chocolate cake. Now, Of course, you ask your question, okay, that's fine, that's great, right? Land and labor, they are original factors of production, but where do the eggs come from? How do we get the semi-sweet chocolate? How do we get the mixer? How do we get the oven? Well, they have to be produced. And so here we have, I guess the print is relatively small, but here we have, and this just shows you how complex the structure of production is. We have a structure of production for flourless chocolate cake. Flourless chocolate cake, of course, is at the bottom here, and then above that we have the land, the labor, the semi-sweet chocolate, the butter, the eggs, the electricity, the oven, the microwave oven, the spring-form pan, the mixer, the bowl, and the spatula. And I'm actually leaving a couple things out because I ran out of space, and this is, too tiny as it is. But then you ask yourself, how do you get semi-sweet chocolate? Where does that come from? It doesn't grow on trees. No, to get semi-sweet chocolate, you need cocoa solids, cocoa butter, sugar, a factory, transport, land and labor. To get butter, you need raw milk, salt, a separator, tanks, a churner, packaging, a dairy plant, electricity, transport, land and labor. How do you get eggs, right? Well, you need a chicken. Right? The chicken comes before the egg, by the way, in case there's any debate on this topic. You need a chicken, you need feed, you need a chicken coop, you need a water, some automated equipment if you're gonna, if they're gonna really produce eggs at a price that we can all afford. You need electricity, a factory, transport, and labor. For electricity, you need power plants, coal or natural gas, wiring, land, and labor. For these other things, the oven, the microwave oven, the spring-form pan, the mixer, the bowl, and spatula, well, you can get those at your local kitchen supply shop. But where do they get their goods, right? They don't just sort of click their heels and have them appear, right? They have to be produced as well, right? And so to make an oven, you need metal machine presses. You need automated equipment, electrical parts, plastic parts, enamel, insulation, hand tools, land and labor. To make the spring-form pan, you need a metal machine, presses, automated equipment, etc. To make the mixer, you need zinc castings, metal parts, machines, paint, tools, electricity, electronic parts, a factory, land and labor. So at every stage of production, the producer obtains the services of the factors of production, and then they obtain them by purchasing them in exchange for money, right? And so let's suppose that we own a dessert shop. We'll call it Just Desserts. I always like shop names that have double meanings, right? Just Desserts. It's all we serve is desserts, and then we're going to give you your Just Desserts. And I know it's early. I'm doing the best I can. Just Desserts, in order to make the flourless chocolate cake that they're going to sell as a consumer good, they need to first spend money on the land, the labor, and all of these capital goods. And then the capital goods then is used in production to produce the low order good that Just Desserts sells as a consumer good. Likewise, the egg producer has to first advance money to the owners of higher order goods. They have to spend money on chickens and on chicken feed and on water and on the chicken coops, etc. They have to spend money there before they can then produce the eggs that then they will sell for money. And so this process, of course, begins clear at the top with the mining of the ores, the metal ores, the farming that's necessary to raise the chickens and the cows that are going to produce the milk. It begins with refining the metals and the zinc that is going to be used in the zinc casting, and production of various other higher order goods. So this is actually, there's a lot of stuff up there, but this is a very, very simplified production structure. And by the way, if anyone I think everybody who is in the social sciences, political science, economics, sociology, if they are at all prone to consider perhaps we need to engage in economic planning, everybody in the social sciences should have somewhere along their line just pick your favorite consumer good and then trace out the entire structure of production for that consumer good. Just do it as an exercise. And by the time you get to the end, you should be figure out that there is no way that we could plan the entire production apparatus for just one little slice of flourless chocolate cake. How are we going to do it for the rest of the economy, right? So I think it's a very helpful exercise. But in any event, As we look at this production structure, there are a couple of important principles that were mentioned by Dr. Salerno. We're just going to review again here. And one of those important principles is that effort moves down the structure of production. Right? Production effort moves down the structure of production, meaning we have to produce the higher order goods first. Right? I mean, we can't make the flourless chocolate cake without the eggs or without the butter. We don't make the flourless chocolate cake and then get some butter to use to make the flour. We can't do that. We have to have the butter first, which means we have to have the raw milk and the churn first before we make the butter. To make the mixer, we have to have the zinc castings first, which means the zinc has to be mined first. Right? And so the production has to begin at the higher stages, and then production effort moves down to the lowest, the stage of the lowest order, the consumer goods stage. On the other hand, value and income is imputed up the structure of production. Why is it that people produce eggs at all anyway? Well, it's because people want them to consume directly, but then also to use to make flourless chocolate cakes, to make flour-full cakes, and other, other things, right? Omelets. Why is it that people produce mixers? Because mixers can be used to produce other things that people value. And so if, for instance, the value of, if people take complete leave of their senses and they say, I don't want any flourless chocolate cake ever again, right? That'd be no way to make America great again, by the way. But if that happens, right, the value of semi-sweet chocolate would fall significantly, right? It wouldn't all go away, right? Because some people, there are other uses for semi-sweet chocolate, but it would fall significantly. And so it would be less valuable. There would be less incentive for semi-sweet chocolate producers to produce as much semi-sweet chocolate, because there would be less revenues being reaped by the producer of semi-sweet chocolate, because people would be buying less of it. And so people value the higher order goods because of the value of the lower order goods. We call that derived demand. And likewise, as people make investments, the income is moving up the structure of production. The flourless chocolate cake producers spend money to obtain the higher order goods, to obtain the butter, the spring-form pan, and the spatula. The spatula maker spends money to obtain the silicone and the molds and the presses necessary to make the spatula, right? And so income, the direction of income is moving up the structure of production. Now those producers who use money to invest in the purchase of factors of production are called capitalists, because it's a time transaction. People, these capital goods producers, they spend money, they advance money in time to owners of higher order goods producers. And then they take those factors and produce the capital good, and then they will sell the capital good to the person who's demanding it at the next stage. And so every act of production like that is a time transaction. The producer advances money to the owners of the factors of production in order to obtain the factors to produce a good that they're going to sell for money, hopefully, but in the future. Right? So there's a present-future dimension throughout the production structure. Now the fact then that all production takes time, each producer of a good must produce in anticipation of the sale of a product. And any investment in the production of a good is made in anticipation of a later sale to lower owner producers or eventually to consumers. Now, we've made this point that if you notice, the bulk of the goods listed on this very simplified production structure, the bulk of these goods are capital goods. They're produced means of production. So the complex structure of production that we have supporting any consumer good is made possible only by the use of capital goods, by produced means of production. And using capital goods requires longer production processes. Using capital goods requires longer production processes. It requires adding stages to the production process. Because in order to obtain a capital good, you have to forego direct satisfaction. You have to forego consumption. If you want to buy, for instance, a standing mixer to use making flourless chocolate cake and pizza dough and other culinary delights, you have to first be willing to sacrifice the money that you would spend on the KitchenAid mixer. You have to do without some other good, right? a consumer good. This is a drift trike. Drift trikes are becoming a thing, it turns out. Like trikes for adults, I guess. Literally, that's what I've seen the pictures anyway. Hey, value subjective, whatever. And so if one has $500 just sort of laying around, they could spend it on a drift trike and get direct satisfaction from that. Or they could spend it on a KitchenAid mixer that you're going to use to produce some other consumer good. So what do we have? We have a situation where the person who's going to obtain the capital good has to forego present consumption. And this sacrificing the restriction of present consumption is what we call saving. It's called saving. So obtaining and accumulating capital requires saving. It requires the restriction of consumption. And then, of course, we're not restricting consumption for restriction of consumption's sake. Those savings are going to be directed to accumulating capital goods. And so when people save their resources, when they direct those resources to the accumulation of capital goods, that's called investment. Right? So save and investment go together. So people save, they restrict consumption in order to invest. But if they're restricting consumption, that means that they're going to be doing it without some present satisfaction. They're going to be reducing their present satisfaction at some level. Why would they do that? Why go to all this trouble just to get your hands on a couple of capital goods? Well, it's because capital goods increase productivity. They increase productivity for the user. And they do so in two ways. Right? The first way is they increase the productivity in tasks we can do without capital goods. Right? You can imagine that it's possible to, say, beat eggs with your fingers. You could crack, 8 eggs in a bowl and just kind of go to town. But, I mean, you could do that, right? I'll be honest, it's not as effective as using a mixer. It takes a lot of hand motion, and you have to move your hands real fast, and at some point you're going to suffer from carpal tunnel syndrome, so it's not easy, right? It's a whole lot easier to put the eggs in a bowl and just hitting the button and let the capital good do its work, right? And it's even better because you put those eggs in the bowl and let the capital goods, while that's doing its thing, you can go over and put you can have the chopped up semi-sweet chocolate and the butter in the bowl and put it in the microwave while the eggs are going, right? So essentially you're doubling your labor in some sense. That's how capital goods increase productivity. Right? They allow us to produce goods that we can produce without a capital good. More importantly, however, capital goods increase our productivity because it allows people to produce goods that otherwise we could not obtain at all. Right? Here is a photo of ancient man. I don't know who the photographer was, but they happened to catch some ancient men fishing in their dugouts, and they're thrusting their hands down into the water. And as the commentary says, before the hook, the pole, and the worm were even thought of, there existed a time known to fish as the Golden Age. Right? And why is that? Because they can't catch fish just by, grabbing their fists down in a pond, right? They need capital goods. They need a pole, a hook, a bow and an arrow or something, right? They need a capital good. Right? And so there are certain goods that we flat out could not have at all without capital goods. I mean, think of what we have here, that projector. Right? The projector, the laptop computers, the smartphones. We would not have those at all if we did not have capital goods. My glasses, you would all be fuzzy if it wasn't for capital goods, because we need capital goods to make glasses. And so there are a whole host of goods that we now look at not even as luxuries, but as necessities that we would not have without capital goods. And so capital goods increase our productivity. In fact, the role of capital is to advance people in time towards their objective in producing a consumer's good. It helps us to achieve our end more quickly. If I had to mix the eggs by hand, it would take quite a long time to do that. And then when I got done, I still would have to take care of the chocolate and the butter and melt them together. But now, with the KitchenAid mixer, as I said, you press it, and it whips it up real nice in about 4 minutes, and that gives you just the right amount of time to melt the chocolate and to melt the butter. I feel like a little bit like Julia Child. I don't know. I'm giving you like cooking instructions. I'm sorry. First you take the chocolate. No. Anyway, so the role of capital advances us in time. It allows us to achieve our end more quickly. So what keeps people from investing more and more resources in capital goods? If capital goods are so, if they help us to be so productive, why don't we just do nothing but invest? Well, it's because of what we call time preference, right? People prefer to have their ends satisfied sooner than later, and one of their ends is a satisfaction from consumption. At some point, people will value the present good more than the same amount than some amount of goods in the future. Right? People do have to eat to survive. If you're going to produce, you have to survive. And so at some point, you're not going to invest 100% of your income, or either in terms of goods or money, in investment, because you have to eat. So the intensity of preferring present money to future money, or present goods to future money, the intensity or the level of time preference, that determines how willing people are to save and invest. People with relatively high time preferences, they want present satisfaction now, and so they're less willing to put off present consumption. They're less willing to save and invest. On the other hand, people with lower time preferences, it's still positive, they still have time preference, but it's not as intense. They're more willing to put off some of their present satisfaction to obtain more capital goods, to consume more in the future. Right? So time preference is very important. Now that leads us to the question of what kind of capital goods and how many capital goods do we accumulate? Choices related to capital goods, right? And one dimension that we have a choice about, we can arrange production in a more or less capital-intensive process, right? If we say, okay, well, we're not going to mix eggs with our fingers, we still have a wide variety of choices to choose from. We can use a fork. You can beat eggs with a fork. You can use a spatula, which is even better. You can use a hand mixer. In fact, the original recipe that I use, by the way, I recommend the recipe from Cook's Illustrated for a flourless chocolate cake. It's called the Ultimate Flourless Chocolate Cake, and they're not kidding. So this is just a little tip from Dr. Ritenour to you all. They recommend using a hand mixer if you can't be more capital intensive. Use a hand mixer and then put it on books. Sort of have a makeshift standing mixer, right? That is okay, but it's better to have an actual standing mixer. Now, if you could go whole hog and have an industrial standing mixer. I mean, this thing is about, that mixer there, clear on the right there for you, that has about, oh my goodness, about 30. This is about 30 times bigger than that bowl, just to give you some perspective on it. That's huge, right? And so this, from left to right, is different levels of capital intensity. Which one is right for the producer? Well, it depends on the preferences of the producer. It becomes a choice variable, right? A producer is not forced, in a free society, he's not forced just to use one type of capital good, right? It can be, there's a range of capital goods, and it's determined by his preferences. Also, each capital good has a different degree of specificity. Think of eggs and spring-form pans, right? Of those two, the spring-form pan that's what's up there in the top right. The spring-form pan is is more specific, right? Spring-form pan only has fewer uses than eggs. Eggs, you use eggs for a whole lot of things. You can eat them, you could eat them raw. I've been told. Rocky Balboa drank them raw before he, beat Apollo Creed. So I guess they're pretty good. You can fry them. You can fry them sunny side up. You can scramble them. You can use them in an omelet. You can use a flourless chocolate cake. You can use a regular cake. You can use them in cookies. You could use them as a weapon. You can use a spring-form pan as a weapon too, but you don't hear about that a lot. But there's a whole host of uses for eggs. Eggs are relatively less specific than spring-form pans. And I would suggest that milk chocolate on the bottom there, the milk chocolate on the left, is probably less specific than semi-sweet chocolate on the right. I don't know if that's true, but there are different levels of specificity. Right? And that's also then something that needs to be taken into account. And it can be, that sort of ups the risk factor a little bit. If you use a factor that's more specific, if the demand for the good that you're producing goes away, the value of that capital good will shrink more than the good that's less specific. Right? For instance, if the demand for flourless chocolate cakes fall, right, the value of spring-form pans would fall more by a larger magnitude than the demand or than the value of eggs, because eggs have a whole lot more uses. So the degree of specificity is something that you have to figure out, something you have to choose. Right? Another choice variable is the durability of the capital good. This also needs to be chosen, because all capital goods are perishable. There's no capital good that lasts forever. They get used up. And this rate at which a capital good gets used up is called depreciation, the rate of depreciation. And so each particular good has a different rate at which it is used up. It has a different duration of serviceability. Eggs, for instance. Eggs used to make a cake are used up just like that. When you crack the eggs and you put them in the bowl, that's it. Right? You can't somehow start mixing the eggs and then say, oh, wait a minute. I didn't mean to do that. I'm going to extract the eggs out of the flourless chocolate cake batter and use them for my omelet. Right? You can't do that. Right? So eggs get used up very quickly. The oven, on the other hand, can last for 15, 20 years. Right? And so different capital goods have different durations of serviceability. In this case, the spatulas, right? This is a spatula. On the one hand, the spatula seems like it's a two-piece spatula. It looks relatively more flimsy, less durable than the other spatulas that are pure whole silicone that are, you look like you could just, bang the snot out of your kitchen with one of those things and they'd still, take a licking and keep on ticking, to quote an old Timex watch commercial. Right? Regardless, capital goods wear out or they become obsolete. And so if someone invests money in, say, spatulas, they spend some money on a spatula and they're using it, right? At some point it wears out. And once the capital good wears out, they're back to where they started, with your fingers, right? And so what do you have to do? Well, in order to maintain the productivity that you get with an initial capital good, the producer has to save over the period of time that he uses that producer good to make a good that he's going to sell for money. He has to save so that he has enough savings to invest in replacing the old capital good after it wears out. And if he's saving just enough to replace the old capital goods as they wear out, we call that maintaining capital. They're maintaining capital. On the other hand, to increase his productivity, right? If you got one spatula, so well, if I had a second spatula, then I could make many flourless chocolate cakes in a row, right? Because after I get done with making one or two, the one spatula is so gummed up with chocolate goodness. Then I'll put that in the dishwasher, and I'll use the second spatula, and I can just keep going, right? And so that increases my productivity. But what does that mean? That requires two spatulas, which means even more saving, right? More saving than just enough to replace the first spatula when it wears out. We have to save even more, so now we can accumulate two spatulas and two KitchenAid mixers and two kitchens, right? So when businesses expand their operations, they're accumulating capital that requires even more saving and investment. Right? And then, of course, on the other hand, we could consume capital. Right? We could just, invest in these spatulas, the eggs, and the semi-sweet chocolate, and just use them up once, not save it all, blow all of our proceeds on bubblegum, cotton candy, and satellite TV, and smarty phones, and TikTok, and Snappy Chat, and what do we have left to show for it? Well, we get a little boost of present consumption satisfaction, and then we're going to be less productive going forward because we have less capital, we have fewer capital goods with which to work. And so the good news, if your goal is to consume capital, you basically don't have to do anything except consume, right? But that lets you allow you to live a little high on the hog for a short period of time, but then your productivity will fall, you'll be less productive, your income will fall, and you will be relatively impoverished. So adding to capital and maintaining capital require saving of a certain threshold. Now, the choice of whether or not to save or invest, the choice of how much to save and invest, ultimately then the choice to accumulate, maintain, or consume capital depends on how much a person values present goods over future goods. Again, it depends on time preference. The capitalist must decide whether or not to restrict consumption now in order to increase consumption in the future. And that decision depends on two things. It depends on the value of the good being produced. Right? How valuable is getting a flourless chocolate cake or revenue from selling flourless chocolate cakes in the future? How valuable is that just in general? And then also, what is my rate of time preference, right? Let's suppose that I can if I put off present consumption for, a couple of weeks, I figure I can make enough flourless chocolate cakes that I can sell over the 2-week period for a certain sum of money. I don't know how much it would be. I haven't really thought it out. Maybe $3,000. It would be a great bake sale. And then I have to ask myself, well, but is all of this, I could be consuming a lot with the money I'm going to have to spend on my factors of production to get $3,000 in 2 weeks. Is it worth it? Well, maybe not. Maybe I can't do without my drift trike. I can't. I just can't. And so I'm not going to be willing to make that investment. And so people's time preference, the rate of time preference, and the value of the product produced are the things that will affect whether or not a person's willing to save and invest in a particular line of production. Now, this is just all the basics of principles related to the structure of production, basically for one little good. And it's a little good, but it's an important little good, the flourless chocolate cake. But the entire economy, of course, this may not be news to you. There are more consumer goods than flourless chocolate cake that exists, right? There's a lot of consumer goods, which means there are a lot of production processes. I mean, just think about that. Think about how complex the production structure for a flourless chocolate cake is, and then just magnify that for the veritable plethora of consumer goods that exist. It is, as I've heard one politician say, it's huge. Right? It's amazing. Right? It is it's tremendous. And the entire economic order in which we live, the entire market division of labor, consists of one integrated, complex production structure. And that's the macroeconomy, what we call the macroeconomy. And as we consider the macroeconomy from the perspective of praxeology, from the perspective of realistic human action, and the fact that action has to take place in time, so all production is a time-intensive process using a myriad of a variety of different consumer producer goods and capital goods and land and labor, we see the distinction between, shall we say, the modern approaches to macro and to the Austrian approach to macro. Modern macro, you can look at, it's sort of divided up into 2 or 3. There's more to it than just this, but there's only so much time that a person has. The Keynesian view, right, where the economy is Y. Why? Because we like it. I don't know. Y is equal to C plus I plus G, and if you want to get sophisticated, plus NX, net exports, right? Well, where does capital show up there? Well, it shows up in the big I, right? It's just a flow of spending, right? You spend more on I, you get more Y. Right? If you spend less Y, you get less I, you get less Y. Right? And for Keynes, the secret to the fluctuations in the economy is fluctuations in the volatile I, right? I think Garrison Helpful knows it's the animal spirits model. Right? When the animal spirits are woohoo, we invest a lot and Y goes up, and then then when the mania wears off, we're kind of sad, and we go in the other direction. And the animal spirits, it's bad juju. And so then we have business depressions. And there is no rhyme or reason, it's just animal spirits. But all of the spending is just in the eye, right? So the more capital spending in general, who cares how we spend it, the better off we'll be. Right? The neoclassical growth model is a macro model that's used a lot. And there we have capital is in that little KT, right? Output in time t is equal to AT times a function of capital and labor. So output's a function of capital and labor. A is this sort of amorphous, I think A is for amorphous actually, a production shift variable, that anything that affects how productive the capital and labor is, then it goes up and down. But the capital itself is K, right? And I don't think it actually is just coincidence that they signify K, a capital with a K as in Kapital, as in Das Kapital. I mean, I don't know, I could be wrong here, but K is for capital, and it's just a homogeneous blob of shmoo, right? Well, all of that, those views of capital in macroeconomics obscures all of the insights of the Austrian structure of production. The fact that the capital goods are actually heterogeneous. They're very different. There's a lot of difference between a spatula and a pound of semi-sweet chocolate. There's a lot of difference between a microwave oven and 8 eggs. There's a lot of difference between a half pound of butter and a springform pan. There's a lot of difference between all of those goods and electricity. Right? So capital goods are heterogeneous with different uses, different specificities, different durations of serviceability. And those capital goods, to produce a flourless chocolate cake, the goods don't just have to exist somewhere, sometime, right? It's not as if, somewhere there's a place for us, somewhere. No, to be useful, to make a flourless chocolate cake, you have to have the chocolate, the eggs, the spatula, the pans, the ovens in your kitchen, at the right time. Right? Having them someday, somewhere, is not going to help you. Right? And so the capital goods have to be in the right place at the right time, in the right combination, with other complementary factors to be productive. All of those things are necessary for production to take place, for economic progress to occur. And all of those factors are obscure when you say capital is I or capital is K. Now, the general economic order is an integrated aggregate production structure that supports the production of all consumer goods. And that's what we get in the Austrian tradition. 20th century Austrians such as Hayek and Rothbard and Roger Garrison and Jesus Huerta de Soto have represented famously the Austrian capital structure as a Hayekian triangle, named after Hayek because I think he used it first. Roger Garrison famously put it on its side. More recently, it seems I remember other contemporary Austrians such as Peter Lewin and others, I think referring to the work of Ludwig Lochmann, so that maybe it's better to represent capital as a web, right? Because it's, in some sense, in their minds, it's not purely linear. For instance, let's suppose, most of these producers of the miners, the refiners, KitchenAid, the springform pan producer, the dessert shop, they're going to use personal computers. Well, so is a personal computer a first stage capital good, a second stage capital good, or a 10th stage capital good? Right? Well, it depends on the computer, right? It depends on where the computer is used. It's dependent upon, where a good fits into the structure of production is dependent upon the subjective use of the user, right? Semi-sweet chocolate could be a consumer good for some people. It has been for me on occasion. It's also a producer good. It depends on how it's used, right? And so those people that want to focus on that aspect say, well, maybe the capital structure is better thought of as a web, not as a linear sort of triangle from the higher stages to the lower stages. I sort of understand what the point they're trying to make, but in reality, the fact is that the economic import of a capital good is always going to be, a capital good, whatever the good is, the specific good is always going to be placed at some order either nearer or farther away from consumption. And so I don't think there's anything about the, say, the Hayekian triangle that makes it, say, less useful than the concept of conceiving of capital good, capital structure as an interlocking web. The main point is simply that capital is not best represented as simply a stock of goods in general, nor a flow of expenditure in general. Capital, if we want to get it right, we have to remember that the capital structure is a structure in which all the parts are interrelated with one another. And they are interrelated with one another through production decisions that are made at every stage of production. Now, the same principles that apply to the individual production process for a flourless chocolate cake apply to all production processes throughout the entire economic order, the entire macroeconomy. Throughout the entire economic order, money moves from the consumer goods industries up through the higher stages of production. At the same time, production effort begins in the form of goods flowing from the highest stages down to the lower orders of production, culminating in the production of all the consumer goods. And at any given moment in our economic order, there is production activity occurring simultaneously at the various stages of the production structure. Right now, somebody is mining zinc that will later be used for making zinc castings. And right now, somebody is making zinc castings that will be used to make a KitchenAid mixer. And right now, KitchenAid mixers are being made that will be used by some thankful soul to make a flourless chocolate cake in the future. And right now, somewhere, someone is making a flourless chocolate cake that they're going to be able to eat tomorrow and experience gastronomical bliss. And so this production it's not as if, okay, we all start, producing only higher order goods, and 10 years from now, that's the only time we're going to get consumer goods. No, the production structure is such that there's production going simultaneously at all of these different stages. And at the lowest stages, producers of consumer goods exchange their products for money. Money moves up from consumers to the supply of consumer goods, from consumers to the suppliers of consumer goods. And the producers of capital goods invest their income, and they invest their income in higher order land, labor, and capital goods, and so on and so forth. Now, as we consider the capital structure, three important facts are brought out to bear. One, production of the entire economy is heavily weighted to production of capital goods. Heavily weighted to the production of capital goods. The amount of money spent on capital goods is much higher than the amount of money spent on consumer goods. You think about all the money in the economy that's spent on, eggs, semi-sweet chocolate, butter, electricity, ovens, metal, refining, mining, all of that stuff, for all of the consumer goods that are being produced, more money spent on capital goods than on consumer goods. So the entire, and this is the key, the entire structure of production then is supporting by saving and investment, not consumption. It is not consumption that drives the economy. It is not consumption that makes the economy possible. It is true that all of the producer goods, all the acts of production is driven towards eventual consumption. But what drives the economy, what makes consumption possible, is production. And so it's saving and investment that drives the economy, not the other way around. Another important principle is that capitalists, the capitalist, the one that saves and invests, is the laborer's benefactor by advancing income to present workers. It's the capitalist, through his investment, that sustains workers through their time-consuming process. The Empire State Building, you may have heard of it. It's been in all the newspapers. The Empire State Building, they began work on it on June 22nd, 1930. It was not finished, and it didn't open until May 1st, 1931. Pretty fast when you think about it. But it was, 11 months for them to finish, right? Before they could accept any tenants and make any money. So suppose you're going to say, hey, I'd like you to come work, I'd like you to start excavation for this, but the bad news is you're not going to get paid for a year. The worker's thinking, I've got a wife and 4 children. How am I going to support my children? Well, that's not my problem. I will give you money when we get money. No, the capitalist invests. He advances money to the worker. Right? Here again, there's not conflict between the capitalist and the laborer. They work together. Right? The laborer supplies a service. The capitalist receives income that allows him to sustain himself and his family. And so the capitalist is the laborer's benefactor. Also, the economic order is extremely complex. It is beyond the capability to design and plan the production structure for a single capital or a single consumer good. It's estimated that there are several million types of consumer goods produced in the U.S. economy. It is simply far beyond the capability of the human mind to comprehend, let alone design, an entire production process that's going to be economically sound, that's going to allow producers to actually economize, to utilize the scarce factors of production to produce the goods that the people want, that they really, really want. Right? The zig-a-zig-ah, so to speak. And so anybody that says, oh, we can easily sort of plan this is living in a fantasy world. That's why we need entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs, using market prices of various capital goods, can then estimate the capital value of the goods and the capital values of firms. And so that's why what Sandy Klein talked about yesterday, the monetary price nexus is the connection between capital goods and the economic concept of capital that is a tool of economic calculation. And which is why Mises is right when he says that capitalism only exists and works. Capital only makes sense in a market with free market prices, which is why it makes sense to refer to the free market as capitalism. It's not cronyism, it's capitalism, because we need those free market prices to use to calculate the capital values of the specific capital goods, to sum up the capital values of the goods, to obtain the capital value for the firm, and then have the entrepreneur decide, should I produce this or that? Should I invest in this line of production or that line of production? Right? It's the use of economic calculation that makes the capital structure and the division of labor a social order and not social chaos. And I'm over time, so I'll stop now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, we'd like to start on time, so please find your seats. Okay, we're going to start the lecture. The lecture this morning is on calculation and socialism. And this is one of the most important topics in Austrian economics, calculation and socialism. Calm down. I mean, Sean's wasn't that good. A little excited. So, as we'll see, calculation and socialism, the topic is really at the core of economic theory. That is at the core of Austrian economic theory. One of the greatest articles written, or the greatest article written in the 20th century was written by Ludwig von Mises, and it was his article called Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. It was written in 1920. I highly recommend you read it. It's in pamphlet form. The article completely destroyed the intellectual foundations of socialism, which is now a very hot topic and something you should be aware of, what socialism exactly is and what its problems are. But secondly, it also really was a revolutionary breakthrough which demonstrated the true nature and function of the price system. And the price system is at the core of the free market economy. I also note that there's a very important epilogue in this pamphlet, okay, by a modern Austrian economist that you might want to read. So it explains and updates Mises' article. Okay. Okay, so let me give you some background. Before Mises came onto the scene, there were two kinds of socialism. And the first kind was called utopian socialism, so named by Karl Marx. Utopian socialism was advocated by a number of people, but there were three very famous advocates, two French men and one Scot. So Charles Fourier, Henri Saint-Simon, and Robert Owen. Now, they had some crazy schemes about how socialism would work. Okay, each of them had their own view of what a socialist society would be, and it was very detailed. Right? On the other hand, later on, Karl Marx and his collaborator, Friedrich Engels, came onto the scene, and they criticized, as we'll see, the utopian socialists, okay, precisely for the fact that the utopian socialists were actually trying to elaborate and explain what socialism would look like. And this is one of the greatest polemical ploys in intellectual history. As we'll see, Marx basically said, if you talk about what socialism is going to look like, you're unscientific. Because socialism is going to come whether we like it or not. And no matter what you do, you cannot speed it up or you cannot change what it will look like. Socialism will rise on the scene with the inexorable laws of history, okay? Just as, for example, feudalism replaced the classical slave societies of Greece and Rome, capitalism replaced feudalism, and socialism will inexorably replace capitalism. And then there was another stage of pure communism. But as we'll see, Marx didn't talk about any of this. But let's look at, now that's, that face really betrays what this person is thinking, okay? That is, he's nuts, okay? So let me just focus on Fourier, okay, as a utopian socialist. So he had this idea that society would be organized according to Greek military formations under socialism. The phalanstère, which is a French word for the Greek phalanx. He gave some specific information about this. He said, well, there'll be garden cities. They'd be modeled after a grand hotel, and each one would contain 1,500 to 1,600 residents, okay? Every resident would be able to purchase accommodations according to individual tastes and income. He wasn't an income redistributionist. All residents would be a stockholder in the city. There'd be collective production. Everybody would work together to produce for the city. All would share meals in the communal kitchen, and the dirty work would be shared. Right? Now, he didn't say how this stuff would occur, but somehow this was the right way to do things. And so he was going to himself try to bring this about through his followers. Even he drew a sketch, okay? Now, all utopian socialists seem to have a mania for perfect symmetry. Notice how that's perfectly symmetrical, okay? That's one of the phalanstères. And that is a model. He actually built a model of it, okay, an architect's model. But he was even crazier than that. Now, this is, by the way, near where I grew up in New Jersey. This is what some of his followers actually built a phalanstère. Now, compare the pretty picture that people paint of socialism, or the model they build of socialism, to what it actually turns out to look like. Okay, a spook house. It's scary. Okay, it's ugly, dilapidated. I mean, that's what socialism would do to the economy. Okay, so what are some of his ramblings? Okay, so he claimed that, as I told you, he was crazy, that France was in the 5th stage of advancement. Okay, it passed through confusion, savagery, patriarchism, and barbarity. But after passing through 2 more stages, now he knew this all exactly. How did he know this stuff? Where did he get? All of them assumed that they had some sort of an intuition, what's called a gnosis, a secret source of knowledge that no one else had or had access to. So after passing through 2 more stages, it would approach the upward slope of harmony. That would be the final stage, would be utter bliss, and it would last for 8,000 years. Okay, then history would reverse itself and run backwards to the first stage. Okay, so people took him seriously. Okay. He also went on and pointed out that 6 new moons in this final stage would replace the one in existence. There would be a halo showering gentle dew around the North Pole. There would be, seas would turn to Kool-Aid, okay? All violent or repulsive beasts would be replaced by their opposites. There would be anti-lions that would offer themselves to be ridden by human beings. There would be anti-chickens that would roasted chickens would fly into people's mouths and so on. So, I mean, he was taken. Now, you see why Marx was embarrassed by all this. Okay. Okay. And the human lifespan in the last harmonic stage would stretch to 144 years, and 5/6 of the time would be devoted to unrestrained pursuit of sexual love. All of these guys were sex maniacs. They all believed in free love. Okay. Okay. So before we get to Marx, the classical economists just destroyed these guys, destroyed their writings, just with simple supply and demand. They said, look, there's an incentive problem. Who's going to take out the garbage under socialism? Okay. How are you going to get people to take out the garbage? We know how we get people to take out the garbage or do dirty, dangerous jobs like going down deep into coal mines and breathing potentially noxious fumes. We pay them, okay? We pay them a differential above other types of work that require the same skill. But that wouldn't exist under socialism, okay? Well, the socialists had an answer. They said, well, a new economic man would appear on the scene who didn't work for money but worked for the approval of society and the improvement of society. But what both sides implicitly assumed, even the classical economists, they assumed that the incentive problem, if it were solved, and they didn't think it could be solved, and they were right, it can't be solved, but they assumed that if it were solved, well, socialism could be just as productive as capitalism, okay? So everyone assumed that. Now, Marx, as I said, he had a brilliant polemical ploy. He wanted to bury the utopian socialists. He wanted to shut them up and never hear from them again. And in a way, he succeeded. He devised his own theory of scientific socialism, okay? And basically what it said was, look, there's these inexorable laws of history, just like we have inexorable laws of the physical world, like gravity and so on. And they dictate that socialism will replace capitalism. That's coming whether human beings want it or not. Therefore, given that, it was unscientific to speculate about what socialism would look like, and it was unscientific to try to speed it up or to try to come up with a scheme which it would follow when it did come on the scene. Okay, so no one wanted to be known as unscientific, so these other socialists all shut up. They followed Marx. They said, you know what, we're not going to talk about it. Okay, in fact, Marx did not talk about it. What was his great work? 'Cause he only published one volume in his lifetime, but the other two were published after he died. The 3-volume work was Das Kapital, Capital. What did he talk about? He only talked about the contradictions of capitalism and how capitalism was going to collapse. He never said a word about socialism, okay? Because he was scientific, right? Really, because he knew if he said anything about it, he'd be laughed at, just like utopian socialists were laughed at and destroyed by the classical economists. And that's where Mises comes on the scene with his great impossibility thesis. Basically, he said that, look, in a developed market economy with hundreds, thousands and thousands of different capital goods, with a multitude of different kinds of labor and other resources, with technology continually changing, okay, you could not engage in rational production without economic calculation. Okay, that was his thesis. It would be impossible under socialism to rationally allocate resources. That is, to allocate resources to the most important uses of consumers or even of the planners themselves, because they would have no test of whether this allocation of resources, whether producing some things and not producing other things, whether producing with a certain technology and another technology, whether or not that was the most valuable, value productive way to go about producing goods. So here's what Mises' argument, step by step. It was very simple. It's simple and straightforward to follow, and it's surprising that no one else had come up with it before, though there were economists before Mises, some economists that came up with pieces of the argument. So basically he pointed out, look, what is socialism? Socialism is the collective ownership of the means of production. So that means that socialism abolishes private property in the means of production, in factories, mines, farms, not necessarily in consumer goods, okay? You own your own clothing, you own your own food, and so on, after you've worked and purchased it. But only the state, okay, and the Central Planning Bureau owns, in the name of society, of course, all of the capital goods and all natural resources. However, if the state is the sole owner of all the natural resources and all the capital goods, then there can be no prices for these things, okay? Because they can't be exchanged, right? You can't exchange with yourself. There has to be different values. People have to have different value scales for different things for these things to be exchanged. But if there's only one mind, there can be no exchange, okay? With no exchange, there's no market prices. If you don't have any market prices, how do you know your costs of production? You can't calculate costs of production. So even if, under socialism, consumers were paid, okay, let's say in the Soviet Union they were paid rubles, and they therefore were free to purchase whatever they wanted or whatever the state produced, there may very well be prices. Let's assume the state didn't set the prices, and actually they did, but let's assume they allowed price of consumer goods to be determined by the supply of goods they produced and the demand that the workers had for those goods. Even that wouldn't be enough, those prices, right? Because what do you compare them to? What do you compare the output prices to? There are no prices of the resources that produce these things. And so therefore the state cannot calculate the cost of production. And in the absence of calculation of profit and loss, socialist planners cannot know the most valuable uses of different resources. So you would have chaotic production under socialism. That was Mises's argument, okay? Once you abolish ownership of the factors of production, the non-material, the non-human material factors of production, okay, all the factories and machinery and mines and farms and so on, then there can be no market prices for these things. So what is the essential mark of socialism? It isn't force. It isn't the fact that you have a dictator, okay? The essential mark of socialism is that there's only one will acting in production, one will determining, even if it's a collective of people, okay? They all own these resources and they're trying to determine what to produce. So Mises says the essential mark of socialism is that one will alone acts. It is immaterial whose will it is. It could be very benevolent, angel-like dictator, or it could be an evil Stalin or Pol Pot type. It doesn't matter, okay? The main thing is that the employment of all factors of production is directed by one agency only. So it could be an agency of human beings, but they all come to a collective judgment about how to organize and produce. One will alone chooses, decides, directs, acts, gives orders. The distinctive mark of socialism is the oneness and indivisibility of the will directing all production activities within the whole social system. So Murray Rothbard, by the way, took this further and said, that's why on a free market you could never even have one huge firm, one very successful entrepreneur, a group of entrepreneurs, organizing all production in one firm. Because at that point they would abolish the markets for different capital goods and natural resources, and there would be no prices, and the whole thing would fall apart. Right. So what are the preconditions of economic calculation? The preconditions, as Mises pointed out, was that there was private property in all the stages of goods, including capital goods of every kind. Okay, so we have private property. The freedom to exchange. Not only can you own things, but you can exchange them. You can alienate them, okay, by exchanging them with someone else. You can give them up in exchange for other goods and services. For example, in medieval England, you could not exchange family land. Even though you could own it, okay, the land had to stay in the family, okay? It couldn't be broken up and sold, okay? And there had to be sound money, money which was not unduly influenced by political factors, okay? Money which retained its value so that entrepreneurs could use it to calculate costs and benefits. But socialism abolishes all of these three preconditions, and therefore socialism abolishes the market for factors of production, and it abolishes the division of labor, which we've talked about. And as a result of that, as we'll see, society cannot exist above a very primitive level under socialism. So let's talk a little bit more about this problem. A production function is really a recipe for how to produce a good, how to technically produce a good. So let's say a socialist planner wants to produce a car. He knows the amount of, there's P tons of steel, there's a certain number of hours of machine time, certain number of hours of unskilled labor, there's engineering labor, there's certain square feet of factory space, kilowatt hours of electricity, and gallons of paint and so on. And this is a car that you get, which is a Chevrolet produced a number of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. So the problem wasn't knowing how to produce this car. In fact, the problem is that there's a lot of different ways of producing this car. And the socialist planner could not know the correct way to produce this car, or even if he should produce, let's say, 100,000 of these cars, or maybe use the resources to produce 1 million bicycles or 50,000 apartment units. He wouldn't know which was the most profitable, which was the most valuable use of those resources. Right. So how can we calculate the cost of producing this car under socialism? Okay. So let's contrast that with capitalism. So under capitalism, how do we know whether we should produce this car or not? Well, there are always, at every moment in time, prices of the factors of production. Every ton of steel has a price. Every gallon of paint has a price. Every kilowatt of electricity has a price. So if you want to produce something and you know the production function, well, then you simply add up the prices of all the different factors of production, and that becomes your cost of production. So let's say that GM, in producing this car, forecasts at the future price. And remember, a car from the drawing board to the time it's produced takes in the US 4 or 5 years, okay? So let's say they know exactly, or they forecast the price at $55,000. Well, then if the costs of production are calculated at $50,000, then they go ahead, they produce, and if they're correct, now they may be wrong about the future demand for this car, they earn a profit of $5,000. They earn a pure profit. So they go ahead and produce the car, okay? On the other hand, if they determine that the future price is only $48,000, and yet it's $50,000 to the cost of production, then they don't go ahead and produce, okay? Because they'll lose money. Now, can they make mistakes? Sure they can. They can think that the price will be $55,000 5 years hence, okay? They're looking at a future market. But it could turn out to be $48,000 or $45,000, okay? And they would then, therefore, make a mistake and lose money. But they would know that they made a mistake, okay? They would know that it turns out that the resources they used had a more valuable use in producing other things than in producing that car, okay? The socialist planner doesn't know any of that. So they keep on doing the same thing over and over again. There's no reason to change. There's no test of whether their production plan is correct or not. Also, how do we know how we should produce this car? Should we produce it with factories traditionally and assembly line and labor? Or is it cheaper to produce by having robots produce it and having only a few guys in the plants to maintain the robots and to operate the computers that run the robots, okay? Which is the more efficient way of producing? We don't know. What kind of bumper should we put on the car? Should we put titanium bumper on the car, okay, which is very strong? Or should we put a steel bumper like we used to in the old days? Or should we use plastic like we do today? Well, I mean, an engineer might say, use titanium. But the problem with that is titanium has much more valuable uses, the scarce amount of titanium in society, in aerospace equipment and airplanes and other things, okay? So you wouldn't put them, that's why we don't see them on automobiles. Okay. So they wouldn't know whether or not to produce the good, how to produce the good, what's the cheapest way of producing the good, what resources to use in producing the good, because they can't calculate. Again, that's not to say that the market economy or that the entrepreneurs are infallible. Okay, they do make mistakes because the future is uncertain. But the future is just as uncertain for socialists, okay, for socialist planners. But yet, they have no way to determine after the fact whether or not they made a mistake or not. Okay, this is a home built in Montana. Now, I had a friend I grew up with who actually wound up marrying a real cowboy and living on a real ranch in Montana. And they actually had cattle drives and so on. So one day, she called me up and we were talking, and she said, oh, we got a new house. I said, oh, you moved out from the ranch? She says, no, we just had the house brought in. I said, what are you talking about? She says, well, you know, the house was built in Omaha, and it was shipped 687 miles to Biddle in pieces, you know, in large modular pieces. Now, that's kind of strange, right? But that was the cheapest way of doing it, because in the Northeast or here in the Southeast, there's a lot of labor, so you have labor come to the site. Labor is cheap, okay, or cheaper than building a factory. However, Montana is like 12 people, and they're all cowboys. So you know, they don't have the comparative advantage in building homes. So what do? It's actually cheaper to have it built in a factory in a city where labor is less scarce, and then shipped 687 miles to the site where it's then put together by the people that built it, okay? Now, would a socialist planner be able to figure that out? An entrepreneur figured it out because they saw profits. They said, you know what? It's actually cheaper to do this, okay? Okay, so these are the types of problems that cannot be solved by socialism, and that results in tremendous waste and inefficiency. Now, a couple things about what criticisms that Mises faced here. One was that, well, you know, people don't have to calculate in all their actions. Well, it's true. Mises only said this applies to an industrial economy, okay, with a multitude of capital goods and other kinds of factors of production, okay? If there was a very simple Crusoe economy where there was only one or two scarce factors of production, like Crusoe's labor and maybe the land where there was near where he could fish and pick blueberries. So there was really not many different kinds of factors of production. Well, then you could figure out your costs, okay, without money, by directly valuing, because that was one of the arguments. Why can't we directly value the goods that are being used to produce in a social society? So take this example. Let's say this person works 12 hours a day and works in 3-hour increments, spends 3 hours fishing, 3 hours picking wild mushrooms, and that's his value scale. Robinson Crusoe, in this case, then, values all of these things more than whatever else he could use his labor time to produce. But now let's say he determines that he finds rabbits on the island, and he wants to vary his diet, so he wants to catch rabbits. What's the cost of catching the rabbit? Okay? And let's say it takes 6 hours to catch a rabbit. Okay? Well, he knows his cost directly. He knows that 6 hours, the opportunity cost of catching the rabbit, would cause him to lose the lowest valued use of the 6 hours, which is 8 coconuts and 1 sack of berries. So he simply says, do I like a rabbit better, or do I like 8 coconuts and 1 sack of berries? He can compare them directly. But once you have multiple stages of production, different orders of goods, and all these different capital goods, you can't do that anymore, okay? It's impossible to do that. Mises recognized that. The other point I want to make before I talk about the former Soviet Union is that, well, actually, let me talk a little bit about this, and then I'll make the point about the Soviet Union. So in the former Soviet Union, we had gross output planning, which under an agency, a central planning agency called Gosplan. And so what happened in this gross output planning scheme was that each ministry that oversaw an industry was given a certain target, a certain amount of nails to produce, a certain amount of chandeliers to produce, a certain amount of tractors to produce, a certain amount of gasoline. And then each industry head then went and allocated to all the different factories, the factory managers, they were given targets, okay? So this is a system of mutual lying, of course, right? Because the factory managers would always want to say that they couldn't produce as much as they really could. They would always, because they know, on the other hand, that the ministers would always try to get them to produce more than they could produce, okay? So what they wanted to do was to get the target as low as possible and then exceed the target and get a nice vacation on the Black Sea, okay? But if the target was too high, well, then they wouldn't meet the target and they'd get a more rigorous vacation in Siberia, okay? So they would lie. So the incentive was to lie about on the one hand, you know, the managers lied, but of course the ministers and Gosplan knew the managers were lying, so they would up the target. So they would, you know, give very low targets, and the others would give high targets, and eventually they'd settle on some target. Okay, but it was very difficult to specify, okay, without prices, to specify not just what goods to produce and how much, but what kinds of goods, what qualities of the goods to produce. Okay. So let me just give you an idea of some of the problems that were faced with this way of planning. For example, there were a lot of structures in the Soviet Union, a lot of industrial buildings and homes that were completely finished and ready for people to move in, except they didn't have any roofs on them. Okay? Why didn't they have any roofs? They didn't have any roofs on them because the nail industry only produced very big nails, very heavy, big nails. They didn't produce the smaller roofing nails that you need in construction. Why did they do that? Because it was easier, because the target was given in terms of tons. So the bigger the nails you produced, okay, producing bigger nails was easier to do to fulfill your target of certain tons of nails. And here's a famous Soviet cartoon. There's the manager telling the minister of the industry, well, comrade, I filled my target, okay, you know, with that huge nail, okay. What were some of the other problems? Women continuously complained that there was no clothing that fit them, petite women in the Soviet Union. The reason? Because the apparel industry they were given a target in terms of yards of cloth, so everybody made huge dresses, okay? And it was very difficult to get children's clothing for that reason. Whereas in a capitalist economy, of course, you have prices. Okay, if there's few children's clothing or not enough clothing for petite women, not enough dresses and so on, the price of those things shoot up, right? It's high profits to be made, and resources are shifted. Okay, so that was another thing. Then there was a very famous comment that was very cryptic at first that Khrushchev, who was the Soviet premier in the 1960s, early 60s, and in the 50s. He was giving a talk about the state of the Soviet Union and its economy, and he began berating the chandelier industry, of all industries. Now, why would he do that? Well, it turns out that chandeliers, okay, when you produce them, your target was a certain number of tons hundreds of tons of chandeliers. So they made them very heavy. And who had chandeliers? Well, party members, the apparatchiks. And they had them in their vacation homes on the Black Sea, and they were falling and killing people when they had dinner parties. Okay, so they're pulling the ceilings down, okay, because they were so heavy. Then there was a famous joke in which, well, this part isn't a joke. When Khrushchev gave a talk at the United Nations, he banged his shoe, famously banged his shoe on the table and said, "We will bury you," meaning our economy will outproduce your economy, will bury the capitalist economy. So Western economists that were there were talking to the Soviet economists, and the Soviet economists said, yeah, we'll bury you except for Hong Kong, because we'll leave Hong Kong as a capitalist nation so we can copy their prices. And that's exactly what the Soviet Union did. So when people say things like, well, Mises said that socialism was impossible, but the Soviet Union lasted for 75 years, so Mises was wrong, okay? But the point was that the Soviet Union wasn't a true socialist economy, okay? It copied prices from the West. There were stories of Maoist China sending away for catalogs from Sears, which was a mail order place, a mail order retailer in the United States. So the Soviet Union lasted because it was like what Mises would say, an island in the middle of a sea of capitalist prices, okay? So it copied, it also traded electricity, it traded gold and so on the market, so it had prices for those things, and it also copied Western prices. Now, these prices were inaccurate when applied to the Soviet economy, okay, because it didn't reflect the true scarcities there, and that's why it eventually broke down. But it wasn't a true socialist economy. It was like the post office, which was terribly inefficient, okay, and still is, but it was terribly inefficient before FedEx and UPS and so on. But they could still operate semi-efficiently. Why? Because they had the prices of all the goods that they needed, even though they weren't using calculation, okay, even though they weren't aimed at profits, okay. That's very important. Okay, so let me just say a word about what's called the social appraisement process. So the lesson that we should learn from Mises is that costs of production cannot come out of one mind, okay? Costs of production involves everybody interacting in society. You and me and everyone else interacting as consumers, laborers, producers, landowners, and entrepreneurs. Okay, so everyone is involved in this, okay? So let me just give you a little schema. So how does this process work? Well, you have the entrepreneurs in purple in the middle there. They look at what they think future consumer prices are. Now, they know what consumer prices are today for these various items, and they have to forecast. They have to use their judgment of how people's values will change, of how technology will change, to focus on or to figure out, forecast, and predict what prices will be in the future. Right? Now, given that, what they think prices will be in the future, they then go into the factors of production markets, the markets for labor, the markets for steel, and all other kinds of capital goods, markets for resources, and they bid according to what they think the value of the output of those resources will be. So at every moment in time, you have a structure of consumer prices, and you have a structure of factor of production prices, or cost of production, okay? Everyone's involved in this, okay? Everybody's involved as consumers in the market for consumers' goods, their values are different, and they interact in markets, and prices arise, okay, at every moment, okay? There's never a moment when there aren't prices for scarce goods, and the same is true in the markets for resources, the factors of production, right? So what Mises says is that although all of us contribute to the price structure, the structure of prices, it transcends any one individual's contribution, which means that it is a truly social phenomenon. It is truly an outcome of society. One person could never replicate the price structure that is used to calculate costs and prices and losses and profits, okay? So Mises called that the intellectual division of labor, and it's just repeating what I said. Everyone's involved in generating this price structure, okay, through their various roles in the market economy, okay? And the prices are a genuine social phenomenon for the reasons that I mentioned, okay? So getting back to the Soviet Union, there was a period when there was true socialism in the Soviet Union. And that was under the war communism from 1917 to about 1921, okay? And that was when there was a civil war between the white Russian forces that were in favor of restoring the Tsar and the Red Army, okay? And so the communists have always blamed that period, the poverty during that period, on that war. But it wasn't really the war. What happened was that they decided they were not going to look at any prices. They were going to produce without looking at prices at all. And they tried to do that, and things did not work out. In fact, by the end of that period, people were taking their furniture, you know, like family heirlooms and so on, and burning the furniture just to stay warm. And then they began to burn parts of their apartment buildings. And eventually the cities emptied out. There was no food being produced, and people would then scavenge the countryside for food, for shelter. And it was at that point that the new economic plan was introduced by Lenin in 1922, which was a 5-year plan in which there was limited private property and gardens and so on, so that people could grow food, and they were beginning to look at Western prices, okay? So true socialism, when it was tried, what did it break down into? It broke down into bands of small groups roaming the countryside, okay? So socialism can exist on that level, on that very primitive level. Okay, so what were some of the responses to Mises? Okay, people took this challenge very, very seriously. As I said, it was a straightforward and clear argument. So in the 1920s, there were a number of German Marxists that responded, okay? This debate between the socialists and Mises didn't really hit the English-speaking world until the 1930s. So the first was, well, you know what? We can have calculation in kind, okay? That is, we'll just add up gallons of paint, tons of steel, kilowatts of electricity. This was proposed by the fanatical Marxist Otto Neurath, okay? And of course, it was just stupid. I mean, he didn't learn, you know, as we all learn in elementary school, that you can't add apples and oranges, Otto. So, you know, he didn't, so Mises had already dismissed that, had already refuted that fallacy in his original article. The second was, well, let's calculate with labor hours, right? Okay, because labor is what produces value, according to Marxists, and Marxist work, by the way, picked up the value theory of the classical economists, okay? But now what's the problem with that, okay? Is labor really homogeneous? Is every hour of labor like every other hour of labor across all human beings in the labor force? Of course not, okay? You have McDonald's cashiers, you have software engineers, brain surgeons. How do you figure out the difference in value between an hour of a brain surgeon's time and an hour of a cashier's time, okay? It's impossible, right? So the hours are, even though they are, you can say they're an hour of labor, they aren't identical, right? Also, even in the same industry, for example, a basketball team, you have LeBron James, and then you have the gawky 12th man sitting on the bench on a basketball team. Okay, so that that didn't fly. Also, it didn't account for the different capital goods. You can have two people, one working with a shovel, digging a ditch, another person working with a backhoe, okay? Who's going to be more productive? Okay? An hour of the guy who's working with the backhoe. So you leave out of account the value of capital, the value of using capital. That's not counted. And so then production becomes chaotic. Or we can, so the Marxists came up with another solution. They said, look, what we'll do is on the first day of socialism, we'll tell everybody to come to work and do the same jobs in the same way you did it the day before, the last day of capitalism, okay? So we'll tell the managers to manage it in exactly the same way, okay? So what are they saying here? Anyone can do that. But that ignores the fact that the whole point of having an economy is to be able to move resources to their most highly valued uses, which are continually changing. Okay, people's values are changing. There's fads and so on. Technology is continually improving. This would only work if people were just robots who bought the same things every day, and no one discovered any new process, and we never had any more natural resources, and the natural resources that we did have never ran out. Everything would have to be exactly the same for every day in the future for this to work. Okay, so of course it was just nonsense. And again, Mises refuted this in that first article. Now, there was a little bit more of a sophisticated response from neoclassically trained economists, economists who were not Marxists, but who had a leaning towards socialism. And these tended to be in Great Britain and in the United States, okay? So they were well trained in neoclassical economics, which was becoming, in the 1930s, starting to become mathematical, okay? So there was the trial and error method in which the socialists said, well, you know, capitalism isn't perfect. The prices are often wrong under capitalism. They have to be changed. People make mistakes by looking at these prices and so on and so forth. And that's all true. But we know that entrepreneurs can figure out that they're making mistakes. Under socialism, how would they find the right prices? There's no way to find it. Mises said, look, with trial and error, if a man loses his wallet, okay, he knows exactly what he's looking for. He knows in advance what the wallet looks like. So when he comes upon it, okay, he'll try different areas where let's say he'll backtrack and find out where he went, remember where he went and go to those places. And when he comes to it, he'll know that he's found it, and that's the correct solution, all right? But under socialism, they don't know what they're looking for. There are no prices, okay? So you have trial and error. Okay, and you keep making mistakes. But how do you ever know when you're right? Okay, you don't. Then there was market socialism, which was put forth by a Polish economist, Oscar Lange, and by a British socialist, Abel Lerner. And Oscar Lange was the one that said that, you know, Mises' argument was correct, and that a statue should be placed in his honor in the hall of socialism, or in the hall of the Central Planning Committee in Poland. Okay, you know, it was of course a sarcastic remark, but basically what they said was that, look, we'll have the Central Planning Board will set prices both in consumer goods and capital goods. Okay, and if there's shortages, then we'll raise the price. If there's surpluses, then we'll have the planners lower the price. And then we'll tell the managers to look at these prices, right, whether they think they're right or wrong, look at these prices and calculate how much to produce, okay, and calculate how to produce at the lowest cost using these fake, phony prices, okay? But the whole problem with that solution is that's what Mises called playing market. They're kids playing market. Who owns all those resources? People that own all those resources are the planning board, okay? They're the ones that set up those prices. Right. Now, and it goes deeper than that. Mises pointed out that to have prices, you already have to have goods and factories and so on. But how do we know that these factories are the right factories? How do we know that what they're equipped with is the correct equipment, the most productive use of resources? So Mises pointed out that capitalism isn't a managerial system where you set up fake prices and you have the managers calculate according to those prices. It's a system of destruction. That is, you destroy firms that are inefficient, and you move capital into firms where there's greater efficiency. Okay, so it's an entrepreneurial system. Some people, different people have to own the different resources, and actually, what Mises said, expose their destiny to their decisions. All right, they can't just play at market. And last, there's a mathematical solution. I'll just mention it very briefly because we're almost out of time. There would be a system of equations set up of a general equilibrium economy in which there were supplies and demands, and the simultaneous system of equations would then have emerged from it a system of shadow prices. Okay, but what Mises pointed out there, and I'll stop here, is that in fact the goods that they were talking about, the supplies of goods that were existing, okay, and the demands for those goods aren't the goods that are relevant to production, because those are the goods that will come into existence and that have to come into existence as you move towards what the consumers want, because there are always mistakes. So you cannot stop today and take all the things that exist today and then set up your supply and demand equations, because what exists today, many of those things were produced in error. Too many railroads were produced in the past, not enough highways, okay? Too many trains, not enough airplanes, and so on. So you don't want to use those supplies in your simultaneous system of simultaneous equations, okay? So I'll stop it here. Thank you. What was that? You want to just put... No, you can get rid of it. Get rid of it.
You have a browser. Okay. I just want my slide.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I was going to get to that, but it's not enough time. Well, the calculation argument is a little different. It's a lot different than what Hayek said was that, look, if you want the mathematical solution, there's so much information that you need. It takes a long time to collect that information. And then, back then in the 1930s, before there weren't any computers, it would take a long time to crank through all the calculations, so that by the time you got a solution for the correct prices, the correct amounts of goods to be produced, by that time, it would already be outdated. So that was one of the knowledge arguments. And then the other one about market socialism, where you set up these prices, what he said there was that, well, they wouldn't have all of the information necessary to set up the correct prices, because it's spread out throughout society. But that's not Mises' point. The prices are fake. They're not real. I mean, they're not made by entrepreneurs who invested money or stockholders who invested money. These things are not made. Those decisions aren't made by those people who will suffer losses if they're wrong. Okay? So it was just like one agency setting up a number of people and telling them, okay, we're going to play a game. I'm going to set these prices, and you're going to use them to calculate, and we're going to pretend that's crazy. No, but yeah, even if you have a supercomputer, you can't do it. Yeah, sure.
I once heard the comment that if you had very small states, monomatic states,
Okay, let's say that. Yeah.
they'd be able to compete between each other.
Even that would be tough. I mean, you'd have to be almost like a small, like an American Indian tribe, where a small household, or 50 people, where they can sort of have a division of labor, and so it would operate on a very primitive level. But even there, calculation would be better, because when Europeans settled into the North American continent, they had very small towns. They still had prices. They might have 100 people in town. They still had prices, and the division of labor was better, more productive.
Have you seen economic calculation where you can actually compute socialism?
It would result in primitivism pretty quickly. I mean, because you have the inheritance of capitalism, all these airplanes and factories and computers. But eventually, as time went on, they would try to produce the same things, but they would become out of date. People's preferences would change. And if they tried to change, they wouldn't know in what direction to go. Mises said it was like standing in the middle of a desert without a compass. You don't know which way to go, right? I mean, let's say you did want to change. You know that people's preferences are changing. How do you decide what to produce? Should you build the house 1,000 miles away and send it and construct it, somewhere else?
In socialist countries, so it's actually impossible to transfer the GDP.
Because they make up prices and they multiply times the amount of output that they produce. That's what happens is that Westerners use their own price. When they want to calculate the Soviet Union's GDP, they use their own prices for goods that are like the ones that are being produced, and they multiply those prices, the real prices. Yeah, to estimate it, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it could be collectivist in the sense that decisions are made by one's mind. You could say in that sense, by an agreement, not by people competing, but by an agreement. It doesn't have to be literally one person doing it, but they agree on the value scale. They agree on how to use the household resources to promote their welfare. Yeah, you could say something like that. I mean, but the family exists in a sea of prices. So you could even use prices in your thinking in making family decisions, right? So you wouldn't be as family alone. Would be purely socialist family, right? I mean, you couldn't have division of labor. If you're outside of society.
What do you think about the Chinese Communist Party, massive infrastructure projects?
Well, I mean, they're inefficient, but at least they know the prices. There's a market economy. And so what they're saying is that despite the prices, we think we think this will improve society's welfare according to what we believe. Okay? But to the extent they know prices, they know what they're giving up. They're giving up the building of more factories to produce nails or something. Okay? There is really no true socialism today. Yeah, I found a collection of them just a few years ago. People still, as late as 1980s, the guy who wrote the introduction to him was a great guy.
Do you think that also plays into the prolongation of the Soviet Union is the massive amount of natural resources that they had available?
That has nothing to do
They're
with it.
constantly exhausted.
Yeah.
Inexhaustible because, you can see, especially with when their railroad booms came in, they were, seeing they were finding extreme abundances of oil
No, I
and
mean,
those natural resources
yeah.
to stop importing them so much using those natural resources.
Well, think of Robinson Crusoe. The reason why you couldn't have communism
Jeff, how are you? Good, good. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this lecture on the theory of interest. We covered a lot of ground in a very short time at Mises University, but we still haven't finished the discussion of the general theory of price. Even though we've talked, I gave the talk Monday on prices of goods, and we at least gave an overview of the prices of consumer goods and producer goods. And then Dr. Sandy Klein applied the same framework, the preferences and demand and supply framework, to the price of money, the purchasing power of money, and gave that explanation. And again, along the way, we pointed out how this approach by the Austrians is distinctive from mainstream economics. But we still haven't done the last step, which we'll do in this talk, and that is to integrate into these theories of price an assessment of time. Now, this requires us to take a couple of steps, and so that's what we'll do in this talk. We'll return once again to the fundamentals of human action, because we want to talk here about human beings as temporal beings. Whereas before, on Monday, we talked, or emphasized in the talk, human beings as finite beings, right? And that's where we build the notion of ends and means and scarcity and so on. So now we want to integrate. We don't want to just, this isn't something we do on the side, but we want to integrate the temporal nature of human existence with the finite nature. We're going to integrate what we can learn about time, and then see how this affects the pricing process. So again, we'll start with these fundamental points, and then we'll build on that to the theory, explain the theory of interest. Okay, so this is how we'll proceed on the fundamental principles. The first point we want to emphasize is, of course, that the moment a person makes a decision to act is never synchronous with the realization of the end. Right? Because we're temporal, right? Those things are always distinct. Or as I put it on the slide, action is always aiming at the decision to act. When we say, oh, I'm going to act towards this, the realization of the end is always in the future. And of course, as Dr. Peter Klein has already spoken about, this involves the issues of uncertainty and entrepreneurship, and the concept of error, and how entrepreneurial element of human action attempts to minimize error in action, and so on. So we don't want to recount all of that. We want to go on to a different element of this that stems out of this temporal distinction between moments in time, and then, of course, between sooner and later, right? These are the important temporal distinctions that we make. Now, there's been already developed, of course, Ludwig von Mises did this, well-developed conceptual and definitional framework for this, and I've just replicated this on the slide. So let's just repeat this. Most of this was already discussed by Dr. Ritenour earlier this morning. There is a period of production in every action, and this is the time that's involved from the beginning of an action to the attainment of the end. This can involve a working time, and this is of course, the stages of production, again, that Dr. Ritenour mentioned. And then there might, in some production processes, be what Mises calls maturing time. So I don't know if this is true of flourless chocolate cake, but, once you produce it, maybe you have to let it sit, for an hour or two or overnight or something before it kind of gels properly. All the ingredients come together in the ideal fashion, right? Or if you want to take a more standard example, it would be like wine, right? That's set aside and then it does its thing, right, chemically, and then you have this maturing time, right, before the action is complete. And then there's the duration of serviceableness of a good, because once a good is produced, then it may generate services over time, again, through various moments in time, right, or over a span of time. And the reason, of course, for thinking about these two concepts with respect to time, as Dr. Ritenour mentioned, these are, for us as human beings, choice variables. We can choose, given our recognition of the possibilities technically, we can choose shorter production processes, periods of production, or we can lengthen out periods of production. We can choose, in producing durable goods, we can choose to produce goods of greater durability or goods of less durability, right? And so this is why it's relevant for us to talk in these terms. This is all the temporal aspect of action. And then finally, Mises gives us this concept that he calls the period of provision. And this is what sometimes is called the time horizon over the planning of action. So we have, we think of action, as we contemplate how we're going to act into the future. Maybe not right away that we would start this action, but we have a planning horizon over which we place our actions in that planning horizon, right? And so there's this period of provision, as Mises calls it. Now, for our purposes to move on, to make the step to move on to the theory of interest, for our purposes, we need this one last phrase, that very memorable phrase that Mises has, and very pregnant with implications. He says, time is an irreversible flux. Time just marches on, like for us as temporal beings. Notice this means that we do not allocate time. Time is not a means that we can possess and then apply to action like we would labor or cash balances that we have, right, where we can save up and accumulate money and then expend it in order to attain an end. Time is just something within which we have to place action. We have to use our means, in other words, that we do control through time. And so this is different, right? It's different from means, and therefore it has these additional implications for us to trace out. Now, we'll notice then two valuations that we make as human beings with respect to time. There are two ways that we value our action with respect to time. One of these is what we might call the timing of action. Because we distinguish between different moments in time, then any particular action we can choose to place at one moment or another moment in time. Just to give you an example of how we do this, just a mundane phenomena of human life. So my youngest son is going to start a Master's of Music Performance degree August 26th at Ithaca College. So this is in Ithaca, New York, in the Finger Lakes area of New York. So he's already rented an apartment. The rent starts August 1st. And my wife and I will help move him up there. So because it's going to take a couple vehicles and all, you know, standard kind of thing, right? And so we'll go up with him and help him move into his apartment and kind of get settled with, you know, finding things in town, things like that. We haven't chosen a date yet. Because it's pretty obvious that not every date between August 1st and August 26th would give us the same value with respect to this, to an identical action, right? We're just going to pack up the cars, we're going to drive, we're going to, you know, transfer the stuff into his apartment and go shopping and, you know, whatever. We're going to do the same action. Should we do it August 15th or August 8th? Or that, well, we choose. That's up to us, right? Up to my wife and I to choose, and my son. And we'll choose according to which of those moments in time we think is more suitable to the attainment of our end that we have. We're thinking, by the way, that it's going to be probably sometime in the second week of August, because that gives them a little bit of time to acclimate to the, you know, to the town and so on. So that's what we're thinking at the moment. But the point is, we do this in every, or at least conceptually, this is possible for us to have this choice alternatives in every action. Then the second way in which we value our action with respect to time is because we distinguish between sooner and later. Not the moment that we take an action, but for any action that we are going to take, we distinguish between attaining the end sooner and attaining the end later. And once again, this is a choice variable for us. We can stretch out actions, and especially as Dr. Ritenour has already explained, we can stretch out the period of production, or we can shrink it and attain our end sooner as opposed to later. Now, I might add here before we go on that hopefully it strikes you that these two elements of valuing with respect to action are nuanced, that there's some difficulties here, right? This is not the easiest area of economic analysis for us to proceed. So we'll do our best with this, but it's understandable if it raises questions in your mind, more so maybe than some of the things we've done up to this point. Okay, so let's go on to the first valuation process and see how this works out, how we might approach this area. And I might add before we go into this in detail that we won't follow up on this. I'm just mentioning this as an aside so that we can make a distinction between this valuing process with respect to action and time preference, the valuing of sooner versus later, because only time preference is relevant for the rate of interest. But it's hard not to keep these two separate. It's an analytical challenge to think about these things separately. Okay, so anyway, as we remarked before, we have this choice with respect to the timing of an action. We notice then the general principle that the value of a good could be different at different moments in time. This is because the conditions for using the good as a consumer good or a producer good could change. And again, the examples of this abound, right? So just take the simple case of oil prices. So most of you know that there are two different kinds of prices for oil, if we think about them temporally. They're what are called spot prices. These are the right now cash prices for oil. If you want to buy, you know, you're a refining company or something, you want to buy oil and refine it, you want to buy it on the market right now. This is called the spot price. In economic theory, sometimes we call this the cash price. And then there are forward prices for oil. And forward prices are prices that two parties who want to trade oil agree to trade, to buy and sell oil at this forward price at some specified date in the future. They don't engage in any trade today. They just make an agreement to trade 6 months from today at a price that they stipulate today. And that price is called the forward price. Now, how does this forward price come into existence? How do they think about what they would be willing to trade at for 6 months from now? Well, the answer is they make an entrepreneurial expectation about this, right? They speculate. What are they speculating about? Well, they're speculating about the market conditions in the oil markets 6 months from today. Because after all, whoever is agreeing to buy oil at a fixed price today, right, at the forward price, could just wait 6 months and buy the oil in the spot market. Instead, what they're going to do is they're going to speculate today as to what they think that spot price will be in 6 months. And if it's more favorable to them to purchase than on a forward contract, that's what they do. Now, forward prices then, because they're speculative, could be either higher, the same, or lower than spot prices. If the forward price 6 months from today for oil is lower than the spot price, then this provides efficient temporal allocation of the oil. Now the oil can be moved from using it at one moment in time when it's less valuable to another moment in time when it's more valuable, or at least it's anticipated to be more valuable. So if in 6 months the forward price is lower than the spot price today, then people who own oil will move it from their anticipated selling in the future to the present. The oil companies will ramp down production. If they're holding stocks of oil, they'll go ahead and sell it instead of holding it off the market and supplying it into the future. And since in every action we always give up what's less valuable to get what's more valuable, we're always giving up this use, this forward price use for the spot price use, the 6 month forward use for the today's use. As the arbitrage occurs, then the spot price and the forward price will come together. Right? Just as would happen, as we explained on Monday, for any value difference that exists in alternatives in human action. And this is a gain. This is economizing. It's very important in an economy to have forward prices. So that the temporal allocation of the good can be most efficiently allocated. By the way, for those of you who are more sophisticated, I want you to think about this as we go along, because we're going to turn to interest rates now. Forward prices and spot prices never come completely together. In futures markets, there's always a interest rate differential between the futures price and the spot price. That's a very interesting fact. It shows you that these two are separate phenomena and not the same at all. Okay, so now let's move to interest rates themselves. And as I suggested, this is a somewhat difficult area in economic theorizing. There are nuances and questions that arise and so on. So I've divided up this material when we turn to the intertemporal aspects of action into two parts. And the first is just a definition, because even here there are difficulties involved. The literature is fraught with ambiguity with respect to even how we define time preference. And so let me give you what I think is the best definition, the most clear, helpful analytical definition of time preference. And you'll find this in Mises and Rothbard, and Frank Federer, I think, is the originator of this particular conception. So here we define time preference this way, that satisfaction of an end sooner is preferred to the satisfaction of the same end later. So a given satisfaction is preferred sooner as opposed to later. You'll notice right away, I hope, that this is a ceteris paribus claim. We're holding the satisfaction the same So we're denying what we just talked about with respect to the timing of an action. We're saying, what if we have an action that gives a certain satisfaction, and it doesn't matter when the satisfaction or the action is taken, when the satisfaction is attained? What if that's the case? Now, that may or may not be the case in real action, right? We're doing a ceteris paribus. By the way, we've already done this. We did this on Monday with the prices of goods in general. We talked about the equally serviceable unit of the good. Right? We talked about although I didn't make this explicit, a student actually pointed this out to me after the talk, and I'm glad that he did this so that I can add this point. I should have said this during the lecture. When we talk about the two laws of utility, the larger the stock of a good, the lower the value of the marginal unit, and the second law, that a larger stock of good is preferred to a smaller stock of a good, that depends upon the assumption or the condition that no matter what the stock of the good is that we're considering, small or large, the item remains a good to us. It's not that we have so much of it that it's no longer scarce and therefore no longer a good. Because if that's true, well, then the laws of utility don't apply. Laws of utility don't apply to non-goods. They apply only to goods. Only things that are scarce with respect to the ends that we intend to use them to attain. So it's a similar thing occurs here. We have to define time preference with this condition, the same satisfaction. We always prefer sooner to later. Now, hopefully it just seems apparent to you, just on the face of it, it seems apparent to you that this is true of temporal beings. For all temporal beings, the sooner satisfaction of a given end would always have to be preferred to a later satisfaction of the same end. Just like more of a good always has to be preferred to less of a good for finite beings. It's the same principle, right? It's the same argument that we're using here. We're just, as the philosophers say, we're just unpacking the meaning of human action. We've got a complex phenomena here, and we're just taking it apart, right, and seeing the different aspects of it. So we don't need any other sort of demonstration. There's no other logical proof of time preference any more than there is, again, a kind of logical proof of the laws of utility. They just fall out, right, as soon as we stipulate what we're speaking about with respect to human action. And so that's why I mention it this way. Now, if this is correct, if this way of thinking about time preference is correct, then the final point on the slide follows, right? Since every action is in the temporal stream, it takes time, right? It's in a temporal setting. Then in every action, a person will always have time preference operating, placing a premium on present over future satisfaction. This will be relevant, in other words, for every action a person takes, since every action is in the temporal stream of events, right? Whether or not this principle of sooner versus later dominates a person's choice, well, that's an open question. But it's always operative. It's always one element of that choice. And it may be that other elements overcome it, right? But it's always there. And so that's important to emphasize. And now let's go to the implications. So once again, my pedagogy here is to divide the discussion of time preference into definitional issues, which we've covered now, and then things that are logically implied once we accept time preference. These are not proofs that time preference exists. These are logical implications that follow from the fact that time preference exists. And again, there's a lot, I mention it like this because there's a lot of confusion in the literature about exactly what all of this discussion refers to. Okay, so Mises, again, I'm drawing most of this material from Mises, and Mises makes the following points, logically deducing them from his acceptance of the definition of time preference that we've already outlined. So he says, first, every time we engage in action, this logically implies that we as human beings do not have infinite periods of provision. We don't have infinite time horizons, right? Because every time we start an action, we by definition, in starting an action, we've got this notion of the period of production and the duration of serviceableness. We must, otherwise we can't act at all. This is a temporal necessity in action. We just don't willy-nilly, start doing things, right? I mean, we could do that, but that wouldn't be action. When we're involved in action, we have an end. And the end is in the, we place it in the temporal stream of time, right? And so we don't have indefinite periods of provision. It's also the case then that action, or at least maybe the slide isn't quite as precise as it should be here, consumption, when we take a good in the present and use it now, right now, for a consumptive end, that demonstrates a preference for the use of that good in the present versus the use of the good in the future, right? It couldn't be the case the other way around. In other words, if we always valued the use of the good in the future, then, we would do so again tomorrow, and then the next day and the next day, and we would never consume it. So this is what Mises says. So it must be the case then that we have time preference that is driving us toward present consumption. And then Mises talks about several intertemporal production choices that we make that, again, make no sense if there isn't time preference. So, for example, he points this out. He says, if we didn't pay any attention to sooner or later, if this was not important to us and we didn't care, then, of course, we would set about immediately on the longest, most productive production processes possible. We would never adopt shorter production processes of less productivity. This is because of the second law of utility. We always prefer more to less. And if we can get more, if it takes us, 50 years, well, if we don't have time preference, that's what we would do. We would just set about the production process that gave us the most output. And again, Mises's point is, we don't do this. We obviously do not do this. In fact, it's conceptually impossible for us to do this. It would be as if, Adam and Eve, when they're kicked out of the garden, instead of, starting a basic production process, extracting things that they can consume out of nature, they set about making a Star Trek beaming device, right? Or a rocket ship to take them to Mars or something. No, that's just because that's more of a good to them if they could have such a thing, right? No, that's not what we do. We organize the intertemporal structure of our production processes. But we do this, of course, as Mises points out, only according to time preference. Notice another point that he makes here is he says that, and this is something, again, that Dr. Ritenour has pointed out already. He says if we think about the technical choices between different production processes in their intertemporal dimension, it's obvious to us, again, on some reflection, that the shortest production processes do not satisfy all of our ends. The shortest production processes are just extracting consumable goods out of nature. Crusoe gathering his coconuts or picking berries, right? The shortest production processes do not satisfy all of our ends, especially the ends that we pursue in modern life, right? Well, that must mean then that in order to proceed to the longer production processes, the longer production process must be more productive, either producing more goods or producing more and better goods, right? Different goods that we can't produce with the shorter production processes. The further implication of that, of course, is that at any moment in time, if we took a snapshot of the intertemporal structure of all the production processes in the economy, we would find that all the shortest, most productive production processes are undertaken. This has important ramifications for business cycle theory, because it means that at any given moment in time, if we want to extend the intertemporal structure of production, we can only do so by adopting longer, more productive production processes. Of course, only, as Dr. Ritenour pointed out, only genuine saving and investing can do this in a sustainable way. The business cycle, of course, is a process where through monetary inflation and credit expansion, this lengthening out of the capital structure gets put into motion but can't be completed and is unsustainable and then is reversed, right? So this is something you'll hear about later in the week. Okay, so that's what Mises, a couple of the points that he makes about the intertemporal production choices. And then Mises also has a section in Human Action where he talks about this point that I put it, that time preference is like preference in general. It cannot be shown false by counterexamples. There are no counterexamples to it. I often, by the way, face it, and it's fine to think this out, right? It's fine to start in your mind to try to think of counterexamples. It's very helpful to sort of work out why there aren't any. But I find this happens, of course, with students who are first starting to learn economics. And they're introduced to the idea of preference, preferring one thing to another, like we did on Monday, right? Where in praxeological economic theory, we define preference as integrated into choice and action. Preference is just that state of mind where a person has rank ordered the alternatives that are perceived by the person in such a way that he's chosen the more highly valued one and set aside the less highly valued one. That's what we mean by preference. Of course, so preference is bound up with action. It's demonstrated in action. So preference is much different than, that concept of preference is much different than what people say about their action. Who cares, as economists, we don't care what people say about their action. That's not what we're trying to explain, right? Leave that to the psychologists to explain. We're trying to explain the action itself. And so I often give this example to my beginning students in economics. I put this on a test as a question, and I say, so we've got Joe here on the street corner, and he's dragging on a cigarette. And his friend Sam comes along, and Joe says to Sam, I wish I could kick this filthy habit. And then it's a multiple choice question, right? And then I say, which of the following is true? A, B, C, or D, or whatever. And but the first answer is, A is Joe prefers to smoke. And the second answer is Joe prefers not to smoke. He'd rather not smoke, and so on and so forth. Well, the answer is A. Of course, he prefers to smoke. How do we know this? Well, that's what he's doing. Right? Who cares what he says about it? We're trying to explain what he's doing. I mean, we might care about, if we're friends of Joe, we might actually care about, why he's doing it, try to talk him out of it and see, right, and all that. But as economic theorists, we're only interested in explaining action itself. So there are no exceptions to this concept of preference. You might think there are at first, but you can't come up with exceptions, right? Because of the way we define it, what we're interested in explaining. So it's the same with time preference. We can't come up with exceptions even though people try to do this and say, oh, well, see, there's no time preference. So Mises has a few of these. Let me mention just a couple to give you a sense of how these work out. So the first one Mises gives is, suppose we have a person who's presented with 2 opera tickets to the opera, but they're for the same evening. So one for Carmen and one for, the Magic Flute or something, right? And the guy says, oh, rats, I wish the Magic Flute ticket were for Saturday. I prefer the future good to the present good. Isn't that a violation of time preference? Well, no, it's not a violation of time preference, Mises says. This is just the finitude of human nature. Again, it's the scarcity of means. Of course, we can't do 2 things at once. That's the problem. We can't go to both operas at the same time. That's what we're regretting, right? And then Mises deals with this famous case of ice in the winter and ice in the summer. So a person in the winter might say, I value ice more in the summer, 6 months from now, right? So is that a violation of time preference that he found? Well, hopefully you can see already, and this is why I went through the timing of an action a little bit, for you to see that, no, that's the answer to the question, to this seeming puzzle, right? That's the solution. In the winter, ice in the summer is simply, the alternatives for using ice in the summer are simply expanded. It's a more robust consumer good. I can sit out on my deck and enjoy iced tea in the heat of the afternoon, whereas I wouldn't dare do that in February. Not in, where I live in Northwest Pennsylvania. Well, I guess I could do it, but it wouldn't be the same good. That's the point. It doesn't have the same value to me. Mises, in fact, goes as far as to say that ice in the winter and ice in the summer are not the same good. Maybe we don't have to go that far, but it's certainly true that the conditions for using the good are different, and therefore the way that we value them has to do with the timing. We haven't kept the ceteris paribus condition intact, right? We've changed the conditions of the use of the good in such a way that it's opened up new uses that are more valuable. And so naturally, we time the use of the ice in the summer. It's not a violation of time preference. And then the third is the case of the miser. So here we have the miser. Isn't the miser, he saves everything, and isn't the miser then an exception to time preference? And Mises says, no, the miser just has low time preference. The miser still consumes. Again, this is a point Dr. Ritenour emphasized. We have to consume to survive. He still consumes, right? It's just that he has extremely low time preference. And so he saves and invests a lot and consumes very little. By the way, I'll leave it to you as a homework problem to ascertain whether or not the miser or the spendthrift, who has very high time preference and spends everything for consumer goods, conveys more, which of those two conveys more social benefit on the rest of us? So if you were in Dr. Ritenour's lecture, you already have a leg up on answering that question. Who is the greater social benefactor, the miser or the spendthrift? Now let's turn to the rate of interest. And we can sketch this. Again, we may not get through with all the nuts and bolts of this, but we can sketch out the argument that you'll find among holders to this theory of the time preference theory, Mises, Rothbard, Fetter, and so on. Just like we did the theory of price on Monday. So you'll notice the top line is just the first part of that schematic that I gave you on Monday, explaining the prices of consumer goods, preferences of the buyers and the sellers, then some of them demand the good, some supply the good, and then as they meet and learn about each other, they gravitate toward the market clearing price so that all their exchanges can be made, and we get the price of the consumer good, which you notice I put in green so that we can correlate it to the producer good price further down in the third line. So we argue the same way about time preference. There are people with low time preference like our miser, there are people with high time preference like our spendthrift. If they get together and learn about each other, it might be the case that the miser can lend to the spendthrift at mutually advantageous rates of interest, where they're both better off, right? The spendthrift is willing to pay a premium to obtain present money that the miser is willing to accept in order to give it up, perhaps, right? We could find people like this, low time preference and high time preference people. And then we would just have a market, we'd have lots of people, and then they would bid and offer against each other, right? And they would gravitate toward what we're going to call here the pure rate of interest, the market clearing time preference rate of interest. And then, as I suggested, what we're doing here is not engaged in some sort of separate analysis, but we're integrating this discussion into what we've done before. And the point of integration would be on the demand for producer goods. Again, this is something that Dr. Ritenour has already emphasized, that there's a discount on the demand that entrepreneurs are willing to pay in order to obtain the services of a producer good. Compared to the marginal revenue product, right, the revenue that's going to be generated by the use of the service of that producer good, if the entrepreneur fronts the money to the owner of that producer good, because that's extending a loan to the owner of the producer good. And so we get the demand for the producer good by the entrepreneur is the discounted marginal revenue product that the entrepreneur anticipates would be forthcoming by the use of that producer good. And that, along with the opportunity cost that's assessed by the producer, the owner of this producer good, will determine the price of the producer good. So all wages are set like this, and prices for capital goods and land, resources, and so on. So now we've completed then the theory of price. We've integrated, and we have a full theory now. Let's go on to some of in the time we have remaining, some of the technical issues involved in this demonstration, though, just like we had done earlier again on Monday. So here again, let's start with just this definition. The pure rate of interest we're defining as the premium on the present or the discount of the future. This premium on the present, discount in the future, the point we want to emphasize here is always expressed in money. The rate of interest is always the trade of present money for future money. It is never the trade of present goods in kind for those same goods in kind in the future. And hopefully the reason for this is evident to you from our previous discussion. It's because if we were to, let's say, make loan agreements in oil, then we would have this extra problem of assessing the future price of oil, in that the future price of oil would be influenced by the timing of the market conditions for oil as a consumer or a producer good. But as Ludwig von Mises points out in Human Action, money as the general medium of exchange has neither consumptive nor productive value. It's not used as a consumer good or a producer good. So it doesn't matter what the conditions of consumption or production are of other goods. Money serves as the medium of exchange, period. And because it serves only as the medium of exchange, it can separate out these timing elements on the price of a good from the intertemporal lending of one good to receive the same good back in the future. Now, as I suggested, there's a lot of literature on this, a lot of debate about all of these topics, right? It's so that may raise questions in your mind, but this is the structure of the argument. Now let's look at again just the preference arrangement. Then, once we have this notion that time preference will always be expressed in the trade of present money for future money, we can just apply this directly to the notions of preference that we had before. So we see in the left-hand case a lower time preference person. This person, notice, does always prefer $1,000 today to $1,000 in 1 year. The $1,000 today is ranked above it. But there might be some amount of money to be received in 1 year that this person would prefer to $1,000 today. And in my example, it's $1,100. So this person would be willing to surrender $1,000 today to obtain $1,100 a year from today. Now, compared to the person on the right side of the slide, person A has lower time preference, less intense time preference. The person demands a smaller premium of the present versus the future. Person B, on the other hand, has higher time preference. In order to bid away $1,000 today from person B, someone would have to pay $1,300. Or, as I've expressed it in the other entry, person B would be willing to pay $1,290 a year from today to get $1,000 today. So if that's true, it's pretty easy to see that person A and person B can engage in an intertemporal exchange. They can lend and borrow. Right? A can lend to B at an interest rate somewhere between 10% and 29%. And B is perfectly willing to engage in this trade. So maybe they decide on 20% rate of interest. And B is better off and A is better off. That's where the interest rate comes from. This is what we call the pure rate of interest then, the interest rate based just upon time preference. Then the next step again is just to put this in the market context. So now we have a whole bunch of people, some with lower time preference, some with higher time preference, and they all come together and learn about each other, and then they gravitate toward the market clearing price. just as before, as we discussed this on Monday, they gravitate toward market clearing prices because at those prices, every lender can find a borrower, every borrower can find a lender. So all the preferences of all the traders are satisfied. At any other interest rate, this would not be so, right? There would be some dissatisfied potential traders. And then I want to make one final point, and again, the PowerPoint slides will be available, and you can see some other things that we didn't have time to get to, but I do want to make this one last point about economic calculation to integrate again with what Dr. Salerno was speaking about. So as we just pointed out, time preference determines what we call now the pure rate of interest, and it also determines then the amount of present money lent and borrowed. Just like in any market, right, the demand and supply determine both the price and the quantity traded of the good. So the extent of intertemporal allocation of things is determined by time preference. The extent of saving and investing, as Dr. Ritenour already explained, is determined by time preferences. Now, the other thing that I want to mention about economic calculation, or the last thing on the slide here, is that the pure rate of interest equates present money with future money. It makes them interchangeable. So I've given just a quick, simple calculation, right? If we want to calculate how much money would I have in the future if I take $1,000 today and lend it out on interest at 25%, the calculation there shows, right, I'd have $1,250. I'd have principal plus interest back. Simultaneously, if I'm engaged in a production process that's going to generate $1,250 in a year, how much would I be willing to pay today to get the resources to generate $1,250 a year from today? The answer is $1,000. The interest rate tells me the answer to the question. That's why it's used to discount, by the entrepreneur, to discount the anticipated future revenues to know, so the entrepreneur knows what to pay today, right, to buy those resources. What discount must be paid so that the entrepreneur can earn interest on the investment the entrepreneur makes. Now, the point that I want to emphasize about economic calculation is what this means for economic calculation is that the money unit that we use, in our economy, the dollar, is the unit of economic calculation across all choice alternatives in action. It's the unit of calculation for all persons, for all goods, for all places, and for all times. It allows economic calculation to integrate all of those different choice alternatives into one integrated system of economizing. Thank you all for your kind attention. Thank you. Let's have lunch. Oh, sure, of course. As I suggested, there are difficulties and the nuances and difficulties and seeming dead ends and all of this. Yeah, I don't follow Mises in doing that. I don't think it's necessary to do that. I think it's only necessary, and I hope I emphasize this, it's only necessary to say that the conditions for the use of the good are radically altered, and therefore its marginal utility assessment is completely disconnected with the other time. There's this timing of the use of the good, and these different circumstances just make it possible for us to get a greater marginal utility because of these outside circumstances. That's how I do avoid that problem. There's another side to this, right? The other side to this is that there is an advantage in defining it as a different good, and the advantage is this point that I just made, because some people also claim that it isn't unique to money. Because after all, an apple is the same good in the future, a hammer or whatever could be the same good, right? And so why not, so what really is the difference between shuts the door. And the money is exactly the same good in the present moment as the future. Because if it isn't, then it doesn't serve as a general means of change. And that's all it's used for, right? It has no consumptive or productive value. So there's certain, it couldn't ever possibly be